Thank you. Thanks very much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us here this morning. Appreciate you all in attendance. For the next 40 to 45 minutes, myself and my colleague Hatem are going to be talking about cyber threat simulation and emulation, and we'll be sharing our experiences to help you understand how threat intelligence can enrich that process and hopefully help you get better results when you're doing it as well. So just to start with basic introductions, my name is Robert Feeney. I'm originally from the Republic of Ireland. I'm based in the Dubai office in the United Arab Emirates. Been working with Mandiant, specifically the academy now, delivering all of our commercial training for almost 3 years. Before that, the rest of my career was as a pen tester and as a red teamer. I'll hand it briefly over to my colleague Hatem, and he can introduce himself.
Yeah, hi everyone, Hatem Mohammed. I'm a member of the Meta Red Team based in Dubai. Prior to this role in Mandiant, I was working for the National CERT in Egypt, doing actually a persistent approach red team operation, which lasts for around like 3 to 6 months. And I spent the last couple of years actually on the opposite direction, performing threat intel based threat hunt and hypothetical approach threat hunt as well.
Okay, so just to give you a brief introduction of what we're going to cover. Myself and Hatem, visiting from the Dubai office, very happy to be here, even though we can't get a good cup of tea or coffee. And we are absolutely delighted to have traveled this long way. We're always happy to visit the US. So, to give you a bit of background, context, and information about what we're covering and why we are covering it. We've noticed a trend over the last couple of years that there has been an increase in demand for red team engagements that are backed by threat intelligence. And this ultimately comes from different maturity levels in organizations, as well as government regulation and compliance. So we serve the EMEA region, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. A lot of what we'll talk about will be specifically related to Europe, as well as the GCC, which is the Gulf Cooperative Council. They're the main regions we see the red teams coming from, where they want a CTI component. 2 big reasons for that. The first one is the Tiber EU regulation, which is the threat intelligence-based ethical red teaming. That is a framework that exists now in Europe. There is 16 countries subscribed to that regulation, so they want CTI component as part of those red team engagements. And that's happened since the creation in 2018. We're seeing it more and more. On the flip side, you also have regulations coming from individual countries as well as individual industries. So for example, you have the SAMA FERT, which is quite a long abbreviation. It's the Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority Financial Entities Ethical Red Teaming Framework. Bit of a mouthful. Could have came up with a better abbreviation, but that's a conversation for another day. You also have ICAST, which is the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. That is intelligence-led cyber attack simulation testing, and there's multiple different countries that have this, as well as different industries. So lots of changes in the approach towards red teaming across the world, and our goals here are to share some experiences with this that we have had, to highlight the utility of CTI in red teaming. We often think of red teaming as the basis for incident response and threat hunting, but it actually has a lot of value for red team engagements and offensive teams as well. We want to discuss how the wording impacts the approach, so that's why we've included simulation and emulation. Very subtle differences between the words, but it can massively impact the type of approach that you take. And ultimately, the devil is in the technical details. So for the agenda, I'm going to discuss the first 2 with you, an introduction, a basic fundamental introduction to CTI, as well as understanding offensive operations. We want to make sure we clearly define that. And you'll also see from Hatem how he has been using CTI in his red teams. We'll look at some weaponization, some case studies. And by the end of it, hopefully, you'll know the difference. But you'll also see one very key important point, is that there is a lot of overlap between them. They are not binary, 1 and 0. It is more like a speedometer. Your actions will dictate how far you lean towards simulation or how far you lean towards emulation. And ultimately, with CTI, you're leaning more towards emulation because you're using that data to help you emulate a threat actor. Okay, so basic introduction to CTI. We have different definitions from different vendors. There's a reason for this, which you'll see on the next slide. We have the one here from NIST, threat information that has been aggregated, transformed, analyzed, etc. Notice the difference in the wording from CrowdStrike. They say that threat intelligence is data. So we have information and data. Then we have the Mandiant definition, knowledge. Knowledge about adversaries, their motivations, capabilities, etc. So you've got information, you have data, and you have knowledge. Now, I quite like these definitions because they use certain keywords. It's not just because I work for Mandiant, but I prefer the knowledge definition. I am a bias, of course, but there's a reason why I like the usage of the word knowledge. And this relates back to the academic framework that we've listed on here, and that helps you to understand the difference between the wording. So if we look at this, you've got data, fundamental part of the pyramid, you have information, knowledge, and using knowledge ultimately leads to wisdom. On the right-hand side, we have the decision risk. So if you're only using data to assist with your decision making, that's a lot more high risk. Whereas if you're using knowledge or intelligence, that's a lot less risk or less risky. Okay, so we'll talk about that. So data, for example, is raw facts. They've no context. For example, the temperature in this room at 11:08 is 22 degrees Celsius. I'm not sure what that is in freedom units, but you get the idea. 72, perfect, okay. That's a raw data measurement, okay? Then we have information. So the data becomes more organized and structured. You see the keywords, you see the keywords here on the right-hand side, the different actions that get taken to add context. So we understand that there's a trend over time. Maybe in the morning before we all enter the room, it's 18 degrees Celsius. It rises to 22 because the room is full of people, and then when we all leave, it drops back down. So there's context and meaning applied to that. So you've got data, becomes information, you add meaning, and it becomes knowledge. So why is this the case? Why does the data change? Data changes because the room fills with people. Okay, excellent. We're getting a little bit better. We're starting to understand the why and the reasoning. Now we apply that to a situation. We use that knowledge to make a decision. This happens because the people enter the room. We are going to automatically adjust the thermostat to cool down while people are in here. That keeps the temperature down and it minimizes excessive usage of that thermostat. Applying that knowledge and insight leads to the development of wisdom. Okay, so this is a generic academic principle associated with data and creating wisdom. Now, let's apply that to threat intelligence. In a technical perspective, again, I've got a reference here to another framework. If we apply this in the cybersecurity space, we've got a framework here to graphically represent the transformation of raw data into intelligence. Same concept, it's a pyramid, it just faces a different direction. So we've got the operational environment. This is essentially just the endpoints. Are they servers? Are they workstations? Then we have the collection of that data, okay? So we're moving to the next phase. So what happens? The data is collected from the endpoint using different tools. That could be something like open network connections, running processes, files on a system. That's processed. And after that information is processed, after that data is processed, it leads to information. So it's further reduced, the context is applied, and the information about that activity is garnered from that data. For example, let's say we have lots of invalid login attempts. That's the raw data. We figure out that that happens out of hours. Now it's information. Okay, so you've got lots of login attempts happening that are failing outside of hours. Starting to see something potentially difficult or suspicious is happening here. Then you have the analysis and production. It's further analyzed to create that intel. We see the brute forcing. We want to understand how that's happening. What are they doing? Are they doing web-based? Are they doing SSH? What are they using to perform it? Is there a delay between the requests? What credentials are they using? Where is the traffic coming from? What password lists are they using? And that ultimately leads to the development of intelligence. The intel is then visualized and shared, and that helps to guide your decision making. Okay, so cyber threat intelligence helps to guide your decision making. And when you have that, and you have used your experience, and you have that knowledge, that leads to somebody having good personal experience and ultimately leads to professional wisdom. So here's some basic examples. Here we've got a screenshot from an operational environment. As you see, we have something called malware.exe. They're not usually that obvious, but it is just for the purpose of an example. And it's running from the C users directory. Okay, so this is the basic operational environment data. Next, we have the data. In here, let's take that executable. It's broken down. The malware analyst or the reverse engineer is looking at it from a deeper perspective. They see these API calls referencing these DLLs. Okay, so now we're starting to get a little bit of information. We move to information, and over time, that process happens. Somebody produces some sort of report. Okay, so now we have information on the suspected malicious activity. When that happens again and again and again over time through that process, ultimately it leads to intelligence. So cyber threat intelligence is the repeating of this process over time to monitor what threat actors are doing. And in here, so this is a screenshot taken from Mandiant Advantage. You got really high-level information, but it's high-fidelity information. It's relatively reliable, and it comes from observed incidents. So we have taken lots of data, crunched it down, and now we have something that's really specific. And the analogy that I like to use to think about this is everybody in the last couple of years has gotten really into like true crime documentaries on Netflix, right? It's one of the trends that has increased in the last few years. And when you see people talking about criminals, they always talk about the criminal's MO, or they do profiles on the criminals. And that's based on how they do recon on the targets that the people that they're targeting, the groups they're targeting, and ultimately it leads to people being experts in a particular type of criminal. This is basically the same concept. We have intelligence on threat groups. We can use that intelligence to help our organization defend themselves. And we can also use that information to help us better emulate threat actors when we're doing red team engagements. So CTI is really useful. It helps with situational awareness and context, and we're going to talk about each of these. We'll just list them for now. So who's targeting you, why, what the emerging threats are. You've got proactive defense. Defense by nature, relatively reactive. Incident response, reactive by nature. Then you start to get into threat hunting. You're proactive now inside of your own environment. Okay. You can use threat intel as threat hunting as the basis for a threat hunt. You can also use it as part of red team engagements. Helps you to prioritize resources. We're all limited in budget, tooling, scope, and human personnel. CTI can help us to prioritize the threats that we are facing and make sure we're making best use of our time. So, situational awareness and context. What do we need to consider? The first thing we need to consider is the politics in the region that our company is existing in. Geopolitics, huge influence, not just in the cyberspace, but a lot of our everyday lives, right? Geographic relativity is important. Where are our offices? What countries are they located in? What countries are they aligned with? The industries that they are in. So if you're in oil and gas, you're going to have a lot of OT-related operational technology. You'll have manufacturing plants. Very different to like an e-commerce site where there's a lot of IT, back-end processing, credit card information. So it helps you to define the threats that are relevant to you. Here, I've got an example. We've built a threat profile for a company which is in the EU, and it is an oil and gas company. Again, another screenshot from our platform, just a random company, no basis in reality, just to show you how you can create a threat profile. So this tells us, and we've got on the bottom axis, less recent activity to most recent activity, and then you have less relevant to more relevant. So the most interesting groups that we should be concerned about if this is our company are listed here on the right-hand side. So you got, I think it's FIN6. Yeah, FIN6. You got APT43 and APT44. So now we've taken that threat intelligence and we said, okay, that's a bit of knowledge. Let's apply that to our own situation. Let's focus on these groups. Defending against these groups first, that helps us to prioritize, gives us situational awareness, and helps us to make best use of that threat intelligence. Okay. Why is this good? It helps us with proactive defense. Here we have another screenshot. If you look at the top, you see a timeline. This is an indicator of the different campaigns that this group, Fin11, have carried out. When they were done, you notice periods of particular activity, and you can see change in their capabilities and adjusting of the TTPs that they use. Now, what are TTPs? Tactics, techniques, and procedures. It's basically the set of steps that they use to accomplish their mission. And a procedure is the specific order of those steps. So in this screenshot, we've got Fin11. We've taken that data and it has been mapped to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which we're going to be discussing shortly. And you can see that these TTPs are of most relevance for this group. So if we have just gotten CTI for the first time in our organization, we've now chosen the threat groups that are most relevant to us. Now we have a list of the TTPs that we want to see our organization can defend itself against. We can give it to the blue team, or we can give it to the red team and say, hey, simulate or emulate this threat group. We want to see if you can get in, whether it be an internal team or a third party. And this really improves efficiency. So one thing that I like to show is with relation to TTP aggregation. This is something that a lot of clients do when they first start to ingest CTI. There's different levels of maturity across every organization in all the regions of the world. Some organizations still do not use CTI. Some have been using it for years. This is just to highlight the example of using CTI to help you prioritize. So here we've got 3 threat groups. Maybe somebody gets the reference to this one. I'll put that little Easter egg in there. So we've got Fin11, we have APT41, and we have APT66, which is in fact the Mandiant red team. We have been given an APT name. So we aggregate the TTPs. Let's collect all of the different TTPs that threat actors use. We will find what is common between them, and then we will focus on those TTPs. So we have taken multiple threat actors. We've only just started to use CTI. We want to prioritize our resources. You can kind of get lost, paralysis by analysis. Oh my God, there's so much information here. What do I do with it? A good way to do that is to aggregate it and say, okay, these threat groups are most relevant to us. We'll start by focusing on what's common, and then we can look at them all individually when we have that baseline. Okay, so I've defined CTI, given you some examples of its usage. That's just to give you context before we get to Hatem's section. So the next thing I want to talk to you about to define and talk about the semantics is the offensive operations. Offensive sometimes has negative connotations. A lot of people think it's taking action against the threat actor or against the threat actor's infrastructure. If you're in one of those few jobs that allows you to do that, pretty cool. But for us, we're typically talking about defensive-centric offensive operations. So that means we're doing offensive things to our organization ethically with permission in a legal manner. So I will define simulation and I will define emulation. Simulation, creating scenarios that replicate the behavior of attackers. Okay, that's the key word. The focus is on mimicking the actions and impact of attacks without necessarily replicating the exact tools and methods used by real-world attackers. The goal is to evaluate how well the organization can detect, respond, and recover. Then we talk about emulation. Is copying the exact TTPs. So copying exactly how they do it. Now, how do you know how they do it? Threat intelligence tells you. So threat intelligence can really help with emulation. It gives you an extra layer of visibility into the lower level data that is required for you to perform those emulation activities. So that means using the same tools, same methods, and the same sequences that real attackers would use to compromise a system. The purpose is to create a realistic representation. That's good. Real is good. And ultimately, it gives you an extra layer of evaluation on your own defenses. So let me define some examples. So for simulation, you have tools or frameworks that help with this, like Purple Sharp or Caldera. They're automated tools. They're more generic. A lot of purple teams will use them. For emulation, you can use something like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, but it does have its limitations, which we're going to discuss. You can also use cyber threat intelligence. As I mentioned, think of it like a speedometer. It's a sliding scale. It's not binary. It's not 1 and 0. Different actions that you take will lean you more towards one or the other. And CTI can help you lean more towards emulation. So for example, if an APT uses Mimikatz, cool. If you want to simulate it or emulate it, if you're simulating it, you might just pull it out of the box, download it off GitHub, try it on the DC. If you're brave enough, you're likely going to get caught, right? A threat actor will still use Mimikatz, but they'll adjust it. They'll make customizations to obfuscate it, to change it so that it's stealthily. And with CTI, you can understand how they've done that so you can emulate it in your environment if you want to emulate that TTP or that threat actor. Now, we talk about simulation and emulation, and there's a key statistic from our MTrends report that I want to highlight to you to help you understand why we're talking about this. So this is the annual Mandiant report. It covers the 1st of January to the 31st of December from the previous year. It is based on all of our investigations that we have done. And it comes from all the incident response, all the threat intel, and then we publish key statistics. It is important, of course, to know that this is a representation of our investigations. The stats might change or look a little bit different depending on the vendor you use. That's the natural field of view bias, the clients that we have, and the organizations that we deal with. So always use multiple sources. Now, one of the key stats that we have in here is that the MITRE attack techniques that we saw in our investigations accounted for 74% of the techniques that we saw. So of all of the different TTPs we've seen in our investigations, 74% were mapped to the MITRE attack framework. What about the other 26%? So if you're only looking at the MITRE attack framework, yeah, you're covering 3/4 and you're in a good place. But if you want to get a little bit better, you got to look at those CTI provided TTPs that are being used as well. So just because the TTPs were mapped to the framework doesn't mean that they were just default behaviors, right? Attackers will adjust the TTPs, they'll make them stealthily, they'll change how they work. And it also depends on the client network and the maturity, which you're definitely going to see in the case studies that Hatem will talk us through. So what about the remaining 26%, right? The remaining quarter. Emulation and CTI can really help you here because it's not going to be listed on that framework. So talk a little bit more about defensive-centric offensive operations. There's generally a couple of different things associated with the red team side of the house. Most basic, fundamental vulnerability assessment, get an automated tool, run it against your systems, remove the false positives, see what's real, give it to the business owner, now it's their problem. Then you got pen testing, focusing on a single asset, web application, Wi-Fi, specific part of the network. You are focusing on finding vulnerabilities in a short space of time with relation to one specific thing. Then you have red teaming. Can go between weeks to months. It's more about completing the whole attack chain, and ultimately you're simulating or emulating a threat actor from start to finish. Then we have CTI, enhanced red teaming. And ultimately this can help you get that extra layer of technical detail that will ultimately improve your defenses in a better way. So this is the Mandiant attacker lifecycle. This is the lifecycle that we use as red teamers when we're thinking about how we progress, but it's also how we communicate our findings to our clients. There's lots of life cycles out there. There's different frameworks. You've got things like the cyber kill chain. This is just how we do it because we believe it's a great way to tell the story of what happened. And it can be understood by non-technical executives as well as technical people. So we start with initial recon. That's your basic reconnaissance, finding the assets belonging to the organization that you're targeting. Your initial compromise is how you try to gain access initially to that organization. So initial recon could be me getting everybody in this room's email. Initial compromise is then me trying to phish you. Okay, so I phish you, hope nobody's going to fall for it. Somebody does, whoops, if somebody does, let me just click back. They open the phishing email, they download the attachment, the malware calls back to my C2 server, command and control, and now I have my foothold inside of your network. And then we enter this encircled area here where there is not such a clear step-by-step process, okay? So it all depends on the context in which the red teamer or the attacker has landed inside of your network. That's why they're in red, and that's why they are encircled, because it's totally dependent on the environment. So they could do internal recon, privilege escalation, lateral movement, or persistence. So they jump between them depending on where the data is. So they want to do those things because that will ultimately help them get to their goal, and that will depend on what their goal is, which is the completion of their mission. Could be data exfiltration, could be data destruction, could even be implementing ransomware. It's going to depend on the threat group. Next, we have the MITRE ATT&CK framework mapped to the similar sort of graphical representation. So you've got the recon and resource development, you have initial access, persistence, defense evasion, privilege escalation, defense evasion again, credential access, lateral movement, and impact. So these are the different sections that the MITRE ATT&CK framework will evaluate the TTPs under. MITRE ATT&CK framework, fantastic, very collaborative, obviously came from NIST, and it was used to initially try to codify attacker behavior. So behavior is more important than static indicators. IPs and domains, malware hashes, they're easy to change, right? All you have to do is change one byte or change one IP address. The MITRE ATT&CK framework was built to quantify the behavior. It's more difficult for you to change your behavior. And this has been a great way for us to keep on top of what threat actors are doing, but it does have its limitations. CTI can enrich that and augment that by giving you more up-to-date information on those TTPs and more specific knowledge or lower level data on how that happens. So in the previous example, you saw the DLLs and the malware creating certain API calls. That might change over time as people figure out new ways to do it. And that's where CTI really helps. So this changes over time, and we're going to see how CTI can enrich this. So I'm going to pass you now to Hatem, who's going to talk about this as we move forward.
Right. So from the typical attacker lifecycle to the CDI-led red teaming. So as you can see, we've added and introduced additional dimension to the traditional cycle, which incorporating actually 4 pre-attack phases. Those phases are all critical. They are threat landscape analysis, threat identification, target identification, then threat identification, and finally the plan scenario. Each of those feeds directly into the red team execution phase. So let's first begin with the threat landscape analysis. So this is the foundation step where the threat intelligence team identifies the potential risk by examining the geographical environment. So they start by asking actually key questions. In which regions or countries does the organization operate? And then what sectors or industries are involved? Is it governmental? Is it financial? Or maybe both? So, and as the organization expands across more industries and regions, the target landscape also grows in complexity. But it's also important to remember that every organization, regardless of the size and sector, can be also a target of the financially motivated groups as well. And we will explain that shortly. So next is the target identification. Here, the threat intel team actively engages with the organization external assets. And that takes probably from days to several weeks. They map the attack surface, identifying employees, social networks, services, products, vendors. And the goal here, we're trying to uncover if there's a data leaks, whether this is publicly available or probably sometimes being sold on the dark web. So we have specific people engaging with this and even acquiring these data, providing this to the client. So, and that extends, as I said, to the underground markets and cybercriminal forms. And those collected intelligence leads to actually 3 crucial insights. The first question should be asked is, who are the potential threat actors? Why and when they might strike? What they are after? And how well they conduct their attacks? And the third phase, threat identification, the team here delves more into understanding specific threat actors, as Rob showed, how they evolve, how they change, how they're changing their TTPs, how they learn and adapt after being kicked or detected out of a specific network. And the Intel team then map those behaviors, again, into the MITRE framework. And finally, all of that goes into the rough, bland scenario. Let's take, for example, this scenario here. I wanted to, first of all, I wanted to talk about ABT 38, and Mandiant believes it is responsible for large-scale financial crimes on behalf of the North Korean regime. So I wanted to open the floor more and ask you, do you think this type of operation falls from the definitions that we provided under simulation or emulation? From the way it looks. Emulation. If you think emulation, raise your hand, please. All right, cool. So who thinks it is simulation? Cool. All right. So with the depth of knowledge and threat intel we have on this specific EBT, including deep analysis of their tactics, techniques, and procedures, we have enough intel to emulate them. So we know exactly everything about them. So we can pretty much replicate everything that we have done. So we can even mirror their actions exactly. So in this phase, the intelligent team builds comprehensive attack scenario for the red team for us. And then scenarios outline probably everything from how the red team will gain access to the critical assets, the crown jewels, the objectives of the operation. And that could range from either just achieving an objective or probably even ransomwaring a real environment. For example, we know that they are using either brute-forcing remote access, RDBs, SSH, and stuff like that, or if they can't, they turn on to spear phishing, or they target managed service provider. Once they are in, they are performing reconnaissance across the domain, situational awareness, using Bloodhound, file shares, and if they got access to a database server or something, they trying to get access to backup systems up until they achieve the objective of moving laterally to specifically Swift systems. We exactly know this information about them. I want to give actually an overview of how the CDI lifecycle, how actually this is getting to us at the end. So during the threat intelligence and red team execution phases, there is some sort of continuous knowledge transfer from the threat intel team to us. The intel team first observes how threat actors interact, adapt, and evolve. Then they start conducting deep analysis based on that. And then they start actually assign, upon performing the deep analysis, sub-tasks. And that eventually comes back to us as knowledge transfer into new capabilities, which what we call capability augmentation, actually. So with all intelligence we've gathered, this phase, we augment our tools and techniques based on our understanding of the threat actors. For example, if we know that a threat actor stopped using PowerShell or .NET and moves to bacon object files, our Flare team reverse engineers that and gives us those insights, and then we start augment our capability and come up with new tools. In some cases, we've developed actually a ransomware to mimic specific financially motivated threat actor. Let's take one example. Well, it's not possible to demo the full red team engagement in this limited time, but I just wanted to quickly share one of the stories. In this example here, actually ABT 29 is a cyber espionage group. It is well known, believed to be backed by the Russian government. One of their most notorious attacks occurred during the SolarWinds supply chain attack. And we learned some of the key lessons here. Even the advanced actors, they have limitations in terms of budget and resources and time. So instead of targeting every government entity and organization individually, they exploited a common weaknesses shared by those organizations, which in this case were the SolarWinds. Another key lesson is, in today's world, it's not enough just to look at your own security, but you must also consider the majority of other vendors, maybe products, and subsidiaries as well. So in one engagement, we were tasked to simulate supply chain attack. How we can do this, how we would approach this. We've already talked about that. So we focused on the most relevant 8 to 10 vendors, subsidiaries that could have remote access into the organization. Then, because we were legally restricted from actively interacting with these vendors, we're not allowed to do this. So what we did is we started by performing the passive OSINT. Things like gather public information about their domains, their employee count, their domains, their employee count, here, their league credential, the services that they offer, the size, and well, in very specific scenario, we found that they had a call center providing help desk services. And a subsidiary had just recently acquired this remote access vendor. So upon assessing the potential threat, we found this could be a potential target, this remote access vendor here. So what we did is, upon agreement, we created a malicious DLL, which is going to be loaded by the vendor's VPN solution. And with the collision with the vendor and the organization, we implemented the payload into their DevOps cycle, into software development cycle. And that we were able to actually establish connection which minimizes the need even for C2. And typically VPN is well positioned into the network. So our goal was to maintain presence and minimize the C2 and focus on data exfiltration. And the results, we were able to do that, and we were well positioned, and that gave the blue team actually unique perspective how to learn how to detect attacks from even trusted resources as well. Another case study, this time that was simulation, of course, because we're just trying to simulate how they would, how a threat actor would infiltrate using supply chain. But this case is pretty much more emulation. Fin12, we had enough data, enough threat intel about them. They are a financially motivated threat actor known for their aggressive TTPs, and they are targeting the medical and medical sector and hospitals. So their strategy involves what they call a smash and grab or shotgun approach. They just rapid, large-scale malware deployment. They want to maximize the profit, so they just go fast and they try to as quickly as possible using ransomware, specifically Ryuk ransomware, and deploying it via Cobalt Strike Bacon, and trying to ransomware everything and get at maximized profits as much as they can. So what we did is, in one engagement, we encountered one specific organization where they had previously targeted by Fin12, and they were hit by ransomware actually. So after recovering, they wanted to test how their improved detection capability to see if they can detect, if they could withstand or detect similar attack. So our task was to determine the deployment of ransomware similar to exactly what Fin12 would do. And here's what we did. We assumed breach, and then we performed we were able to move laterally to one of those servers via RPC, and also we were able to do reconnaissance via Bloodhound. We were able to identify one of the vulnerable EDCS certificate templates, and then we moved laterally to 4 different servers using the exact same RPC method that they use. And eventually, we were able to ransomware their environment using the exact same technique as Fin12, even using Ryuk ransomware. So we implemented and augmented this capability. It's a ransomware, this is a proprietary tool. We were able to mimic the exact behavior. And that's just a couple of screenshots from how we operate exactly like Fin12. Yeah, sure.
Thanks, Hatem. So I think that's 2 very solid examples to highlight the difference between simulation and emulation. And with that cyber threat intelligence, you can really move the needle more towards emulation when you have that technical data available to you. Now, from speaking with other colleagues within Mandiant, they've given some great examples of other things that they have done in the past using threat intelligence to help emulate. So I've just listed them here on screen for your benefit. You might have some additional ones that you can share with us as well. So some technical emulation ideas, expired domains. We've had some red teamers before actually buy expired domains that are known to be associated with previous threat actors. That has led, of course, to a few interesting situations where they see callbacks, which of course legally you have to ignore. But ultimately, it checks to see if the client that you're dealing with or the defensive capabilities that you're using are still checking against old data related to threat actors. We've also seen the adjustment of malleable C2 profiles, tools like Cobalt Strike. We've got malware emulation, and then the more generic stuff, which we're not going to cover too much in depth by emulating tools and CVEs. So just some example screenshots. Sorry, I see there's some pictures. I'll jump back real quick. Yeah, all good. So expired domains, same process as you would do on a regular red team engagement if you're doing it for yourself. The difference is you're targeting domains that show up from CTI that are known to be associated with a threat actor, and they have high fidelity associated with those IOCs. Next, you've got the C2 profiles. You'll find on GitHub many different profiles that can be used to mimic known threat groups or threat actors. You can also adjust these yourself if you have more actionable or more recent threat intelligence to build the IOCs into what you're doing, to see if the organization you're doing it for can actually detect that more recent activity and those types of activities. Malware emulation. Okay, first thing, same API usage, kernel 32, who cares? Every binary uses that, but then you get a little bit more lower data. You start looking at how the code was developed. Do they use process hijacking? Do they use indirect syscalls? Do they have the same loaders, the same coding patterns? Is the anatomy of the malware the same? So you want to replicate that malware, but you're doing it with emulation in mind, and you have control over it. So that's another thing that we've done. There's also tools and CVEs. That's more generic. Can anybody else think of anything that you might do to emulate a threat actor? If you can't, don't worry. But hopefully these have got you on the right frame of thinking towards what you could or might be able to do. So some key takeaways. We just have 2 minutes left. Key takeaways from this. The primary purpose of CTI-backed red teaming is to ensure the outcome of the execution phase is enriched with further value. So the blue team can learn, and so you can ultimately improve your defenses. Third bullet point, you want to include the routes not taken during the execution. You also sometimes will be asked, especially if you're doing it internally or you're doing it for a third party, they want to see the CTI that you used. So you give them the CTI report as well if you can legally do that. That helps them as well, and it also helps with the routes not taken. There is often pivoting between simulation and emulation. If you try emulation and it doesn't work, what's a threat actor going to do if they do their normal techniques and it doesn't work? They're going to pivot, right? Now, we don't know how they're going to pivot. So we have to simulate an emulation of the attacker's behavior. So there's a big overlap between the decision you take, what you know that they might do, what you don't know what they might do, so you pivot between simulation and emulation. The other thing you could do, if you want to get more up-to-date information, you start talking about threat deception strategies, implementing honeypots, having areas of the network where there's a honey net. You could do that as well, but that's a whole different talk. APTs are unique, and using cyber threat intelligence to back your red teaming is a fantastic way to augment the limitations of the frameworks that we are currently using. So with that, I'll just say thank you very much. There's specific people who have assisted us with this. Without them, it wouldn't have happened. We very much appreciate their support. And thank you all from myself and from Hatem as well. Hope you enjoyed the talk. And if anybody has any questions, please let us know. Thank you.